Ahul, his colleagues. I just want to mention a few housekeeping guidelines. After we have had the sessions, we will have a discussion session where you will have all your questions and answers and comments at that point. So we will start with the presentations, and then we'll have the discussion session after. Just before we close. And the other thing as well is you could type any of your questions on the chat and we'll pick them. Also, just to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. And so we'll be able to share with everyone else later the outcomes. So welcome. Without much ado, I just want to invite Dr. Obura to introduce, give us introductory remarks and also introduce the panel. Welcome.
Hey. Thank you. Thank you very much, Luther. It's a pleasure to be here and to be on this first of the fireside chats. Let me get my screen up here because it'll help with the introductions a little bit. And I hope the slide is visible to everybody in the right format. So my name is David Obura. I know some of you, of course, my organization, Cordio, is an IUCN member, and we've been very active together for over 20 years on marine and coastal issues in East Africa. But I'm also now chair of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. We produce assessment reports, as many of you know, and we have just produced two. They were approved at our plenary, which was in Namibia, the first IPBES plenary to be held in Africa in Windhoek in December. One on the Nexus assessment or on the interlinkages among biodiversity, water, food, and health, and the Transformative Change assessment, which has an even longer title, but looking at the underlying causes of the challenges that we're facing now. And with me, I'm very lucky to have some of our key people involved in these assessments. So Karen O'Brien from the University of Oslo, who was a co-chair of the Transformative Change Assessment, and then Nadia Sitas from the Climate and Development Knowledge Network in Stellenbosch University, and Odi Selemane from the University of Pretoria, both coordinating lead authors in the Nexus assessment. Now, what I'd like to do, and what the regional office had proposed in this first fireside chat, is to pick up on these conservation conversations. For those of you who attended the Regional Forum for Africa in June in Nairobi, I presented the keynote address at the Regional Forum, and I essentially based it on the background work from IPBES that underlies these two assessments. At that time, I couldn't present the results of the assessments because they weren't approved, but now you'll get to hear them directly from those who led the production of the reports. The summaries for policymakers are approved and are available online, and we can provide the links later on. They're in the information for the session. And the full assessments will become available within a few months when we clean up the documentation. I'm very excited about these assessments because when I first saw the scoping reports for them, first the Nexus assessment and then Transformative Change, I felt they really address the core of the challenges that we face for conservation and sustainable development in Africa, the essential linkages between these two concepts and how essential they are for each other. So what I'd like to do now is I'll do a short introduction about IPBES and the broader framing, but from an IUCN and conservation perspective in Africa, picking up from the Regional Conservation Forum. Then I'll hand over to Karen O'Brien, who will present on the Transformative Change assessment, and then to Nadia, who will present on the Nexus assessment. And then after that, we'll have a conversation, and hopefully we'll stimulate a lot of comments, questions, discussion, even difficult ones from all of you. So without further ado, I'll launch straight into my first slide. So IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel or Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, I think many of you are probably well aware of it. Many of you perhaps participate in our various assessments and processes because there is a lot of overlap. There's a big participation from the African science and conservation community in IPBES. So up until now, we have produced 13 assessments with these 2 that have just been approved. There are, 2 in progress right now and 3 that are upcoming up to 2029. And we have 2 workshop reports that were produced as well. In order to organize all of this work, we have developed this conceptual framework, which was published in 2015. And what it does is it was produced after about a 2 or 3 year process to work out how to organize synthesis of information on nature and its support to people. So the concept of nature's contributions to people is a core one for IPBES that was produced around the same time, broadening out from the concept of ecosystem services, which were fairly narrow towards sort of quantifiable benefits from nature, to more intangible ones. And so the concept of nature's contributions to people is very important, particularly in an African context where people are so dependent on nature for their livelihoods. And then how these contribute to good quality of life, the indirect and direct drivers that impact on nature from our various choices and uses that we make of it. Now, this is much more than just about conservation. When you look at people's dependence on nature, you really see that nature supports our entire economies. If you look from a fairly narrow framing of the current global economy and the framings that we have, we monetize certain contributions from nature. There are many that we don't. These feed our economy, and the economy is what really imposes the direct drivers on nature, and you get this feedback loop. And then from economy, we share benefits in society, either well or poorly, and also societal values impose indirect drivers that determine how we promulgate our economy and how that happens. So when you're looking at daily life for people across landscapes and seascapes, sustainability isn't just about conservation and actions on nature. We need actions on economy and society as well. And these need to all be coherent with one another to work. And then up to the policy level, these are the global frameworks, and we could put many more on this slide. All these policies that control our actions on nature, our economic choices, and societal aspects need to be consistent with one another, particularly now that global population and global economic activity is so large that we are having impacts on the planet as a whole. So coming to what these 2 assessments really look at, we have tended to look in conservation at nature itself, the places we'd like to conserve and the species, and how to understand and manage those, which of course we need to do. But what are the drivers of the challenges that we are facing? And I think it's really necessary now to fully realize that economy, or inequality in the economy particularly, is a primary driver of global biodiversity decline. And the thing is that economic actors are not all equal. These 2 graphs, so I showed these 2 graphs back in the Conservation Forum, the G7 economies on the left and the low-income country economies on the right, from 2000 and 2020. Both of them have increased about a similar proportion, but you can see that the G7 economies are 100 times larger than the low-income economies, and their population numbers are just about the same. So these are quite comparable. So the impacts from the economies on the left are much greater than the impact from the economies on the right. And then when you look at this from a carbon dioxide, so a physical sort of reflection of the economic system, our carbon emissions really reflect our energy use and our economic activity. This is from the Climate Inequality Report. And this shows the differences between, in terms of income levels globally, the bottom 50%, the middle 40%, the top 10%. The relative losses compared to the emissions of the bottom 50% is a completely different equation than the top 10%. So the vulnerability and the contributions are inverted. And these types of inequalities are the things that we need to address, the underlying causes of the decline in biodiversity, which is mirrored by climate change and by the other crises that we face. And so this is the question that these 2 assessments were charged to look at the underlying causes of biodiversity decline, but from opposite levels or different directions, and we'll get into that in a moment. What I'd like to do is to focus in on, we're having these discussions as a prelude to building up to the World Conservation Congress in 2025, which will be in October this year, to stimulate this discussion. What do we need to see happen to effectively conserve African ecosystems and African biodiversity? Now, again, the science, this is a paper from 2020, future scenarios of bending the curve of biodiversity decline, showing the difference between business as usual, full implementation of conservation and restoration actions in orange, and that plus all the right actions in production and consumption sectors and circular economy in green. And you can see from these studies that even with actions, we don't get to a positive biodiversity outcome by 2100 compared to 2010 was the baseline when this study was produced. 2024, we're over here. So it's important to be very clear about where we are and what the possibilities are from different sorts of actions. Another key line that should be added here is that it's not that humanity is doing nothing. With no conservation actions, the state of nature would be lower, perhaps that red line. That's just just hand drawn there. And the study from early 2024 that showed about half of conservation actions produce net positive impacts, but the other half, they either just reduce the decline or have no effect. So conservation actions are critical, they're important, but they're not sufficient. Sorry, trying to advance this. And we need to address the production and consumption factors fully. And that's where these two assessments really focus. What do we need to think about in the conservation community in this sense? So how do we move forward, thinking about the various frameworks that we have at hand? Now, these lines can be thought of, the endpoints can be thought of visions of plausible futures. We have one very implausible vision of a future in this curve for nature positive, which I think, I put this up because I think it's very important, especially in Africa, to be completely realistic to those who need to invest in conservation to understand what the benefits they will obtain or they may obtain will be. It doesn't help poor communities and poor countries to try and achieve endpoints that are impossible. They need to really understand what the reality of the situation is so we understand who needs to invest what. And so for this, I think what these two assessments really help us do is to look at really understanding the true impact of direct biodiversity actions. What can we achieve just by focusing on those? And to be very realistic about the inertia and responsivity of biodiversity decline. We need to invest in actions about direct and indirect drivers of decline. The Nexus assessment is very direct about that. And then we need to address issues of justice and equity, and transformative change assessment really addresses that very squarely and head on. And these two assessments meet in the middle. They're very complementary to each other. So I think that's my final slide on that. And what I would do now is suggest we go through presentations on each of those assessments, first on transformative change by Karen O'Brien, and then on the next assessment by Nadia Citas, and then we'll open up for discussion after that. I see a hand is raised. Can I suggest at this point, if you have a quick comment, you write it in the chat, but otherwise keep your questions for after we finish the presentations, because I think that will help for consistency. So with that, let me hand over to Karen. The floor is yours.
Right. Thank you, David, and thanks for inviting me here to speak to you about the transformative change assessment. I'm just going to share some slides and walk you through this assessment in 10 minutes, and then it'll be a very quick overview, but it'll give us some room for discussion then. So let me see if you can see the slides. The IPBES Transformative Change Assessment, as David just described, is really it's a foundational assessment and the first of its kind, both conceptually and empirically, because it brings together a wide range of knowledge, not just on what we need to do to transform and bend those curves, but also how do we do it. And just a little bit on the process. We had experts from 42 countries from around the world. including 11 authors from Africa. And these include, if I can get them right, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Madagascar, Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia. And we had a strong gender balance. We had a lot of social and interdisciplinary scientists, and we did a rigorous assessment of 7,000 references and received 10,000 comments, etc. So this really was bringing together different perspectives on transformative change. And our summary for policymakers is divided into 3 sections. And the first section is really the starting point that we just heard about from David. The transformative change is urgent, necessary, and challenging. But we also find that it is possible, and we show this, we show how it can be realized in practice in the assessment. The second part of the assessment is on the strategies and actions for transformative change, and I'll just mention those. And also the third part is that there are roles for everybody in transformative change. And I think this is really important, that it's not just for governments or not just for civil society, it's for everyone. And building on the global assessment, we define transformative change for a just and sustainable world as changes that shift views, structures, and practices in ways that address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature's decline. So there's a lot that we can do, but a lot of efforts underway. But if they don't get at those causes, they're not actually contributing to the transformative changes that we're needing. And that, I think, is a novel introduction from this. And what do we say are the key underlying causes then? And our assessment identified 3 of them. And just to be clear, underlying causes are those deeply rooted and interconnected social and cultural patterns that shape, influence, and reinforce all of the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss that have been made very clear in many of our previous assessments. And so the first one we identified is disconnection from and domination over nature and people. The second one is the concentration of power and wealth. And the third one is the prioritization of short-term individual and material gains. And all 3 of these work together. It's not that one is, it's not that number 1 is the most, or that they're all very much entangled with each other. So how do we then actually move forward? And this is where it becomes like, what actually needs to change? And our assessment recognizes that that it's important that not everything needs to change. There is actually a lot that can be amplified and promoted. We conclude that it remains important to recognize and strengthen views, structures, and practices that are aligned with generating a just and sustainable world, such as those of many Indigenous peoples and local communities. And we have a database of almost 400 case studies from around the world. And one of them that included in the summary for policymakers is the Nashalai Maasai Conservancy in Kenya, which is one of the located in one of the world's most biodiverse ecosystems. And Nashalai means coexistence. So the values of coexistence, dignity, inclusivity, and self-determination and empowerment and human rights are really the basis for a new model of conservation that responds to species loss of cultural knowledge, livelihood struggles, and climate change. So it really is a Nexus approach. And we'll hear more about the Nexus approach. But then, how do we actually address those underlying causes? And this brings us to the key principles of transformative change. The entry points for the actions that we take really need to be based on the normative principles of equity and justice, of pluralism and inclusion, of respectful and reciprocal human nature relationships, and the process-based principle of adaptive learning and action, because we recognize that sometimes what we do will have unintended consequences. So we always have to be able to look for those and then adjust as we go on. So these key principles of transformative change really are like they're really bringing the values, as discussed in the values assessment, into the actions that we take for transformative change to produce the results. And reality checks are really important, as David said, and that we will find we hit a lot of challenges and barriers to transformative change. And our assessment identified 5 of these. The first one is relations of domination over nature and people, which are very much linked to those underlying causes that we heard about. Economic and political inequalities is the second. Inadequate policies and unfit institutions is the third, and that really is like the mismatch between the scope of the problem and where the solutions lie. And fourth is unsustainable consumption and production patterns. And the fifth is limited access to clean technologies and uncoordinated knowledge and innovation systems. And so our assessment identified the challenges that, these are persistent, systemic, and pervasive. And each of them manifest as barriers in different contexts that we actually are reinforcing the status quo wherever we are. And that's where we start to say, well, how do we overcome them? What do we need to do differently? And this brings us to the knowledge that we have. And we recognize there's no one approach that's actually ideal. We need to bring together different knowledge systems, including Indigenous and local knowledge, to enhance these strategies. And the ones we looked at in the assessment, we looked at maybe like 64 different approaches and models. And so we have systems approaches, structural approaches, inner transformations, empowerment approaches, science and technology, and also knowledge co-creation. And one of the findings that I think is really important from this assessment is that we emphasize that both small-scale and large-scale changes contribute to transformative change when they address the underlying causes. So often we think of transformative change as this like big, vast, abstract thing, but it's very much these small changes we make when they're aligned with the principles, when they address the underlying causes, they make a difference. And when we analyze the case studies, we found that many of them actually produce positive results for nature and for people in less than 10 years. And I think that's really good news, is that the actions, the conservation actions that we're taking, the social innovations, they are making a difference. And that brings us then to what do we do and how do we do it? So we have identified 5 key strategies and then associated actions with each of them, that all of them have complementary and synergistic effects. So it's not that, we just need, like you might look at the first one, conserving and regenerating places of value to nature and people, and say, yes, let's do that. But we also need to be driving systemic changes in the sectors most responsible for biodiversity loss and nature decline. And that can be agriculture, forestry, fisheries, energy production. There's many of them that are part of those drivers. The third strategy is transforming economic systems for nature and equity. And that means including the financial systems. And so we go into 4 or 5 different actions that are aligned with that. And then we have transforming governance systems to be integrated, inclusive, accountable, and adaptive. And then finally, shifting societal views and values to recognize and prioritize fundamental interconnections between humans and natures. And in the assessment, we talk a lot about that there are many places on the planet right now, people are living with a connection to nature. For example, Ubuntu, the value system that focuses on reciprocity, dialogue, and collective humanity is one example. And in Africa, we also have from Ethiopia, Safu, a principle where people are impelled to respect and do justice to their spirit and that of other beings. So we actually have lots of cases, lots of examples, and we really need to promote and amplify them to share, to produce the shared change. And that brings us then to how do we do this? And David talked about those positive visions that we need to recognize the socioecological interdependency and the agency of non-human life forms. And also an ethics of care that can inspire transformative change. So we've collected about 800 visions and looked at those and say, what do they have in common? And all of them are, how do we actually realize the 2050 vision for biodiversity of living in harmony with nature? And that brings us to the roles for all. And we know that transformative change is system-wide, and that to achieve it will require a whole of society and a whole of government approach. We have to engage all actors, all sectors, and in the visioning and contributing to this. So we spell out what needs to be done, by whom and how, and recognizing that, governments are powerful enablers of transformative change when they foster policy coherence, as we'll hear in the Nexus we'll hear from Nadia, and then when they enact and enforce stronger regulations to benefit nature and nature's contributions to people, and innovative economic fiscal tools, eliminating and this includes eliminating, phasing out, or reforming environmentally harmful subsidies. So all of this is like, okay, we need to do this much better. And I know I'm running out of time now, but finally, we emphasize the role of civil society in transformative change and the importance of protecting civil society initiatives and environmental defenders, because many people face violence and rights violations when they are working for transformative change. So we've highlighted that, and we show that there are social movements all around the world that are working for these changes. And just to finalize this, to bring it all together, we include in the summary for policymakers a practical user's guidance so that you could actually use this in every project, initiative, and everything that you're working on. So that's the fastest I've presented this assessment. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to having a fireside chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was indeed the fastest I've ever heard this assessment presented in, but really coherent and really touching well on all the aspects that need to be looked at. I think, of course, that will be relevant to many people in the conversation that we have. So with that, let me hand over to the Nexus assessment, and so to Nadia and your introduction of that. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, that's good.
Okay, fantastic. So hi, I am part of the team that will be chatting about the Nexus assessment. So we've also got Odi Selemani, who's also coordinating lead author on the call, leading some of the work on the futuring, and some lovely synergies and complementarity between the two assessments. And what the Nexus assessment really dug into was looking for the evidence around the interlinkages amongst biodiversity, water, food, health, and also climate. So it's not presented here in the title, but it is one of the other elements that we did look into, acknowledging that it's also one of the big drivers of change as well. So similarly, to the transformative change assessment, these types of processes unfold over numerous years. So it was produced over a period of 3 years through a selection of different experts. And I've just highlighted some of the African experts that were included. So we had an African co-chair of the assessment, but we had to release him so he could be the chair of IPBES in general. But in terms of coordinating lead authors and lead authors, a spread of experts from countries in Africa. And again, this assessment drew on thousands of sources of evidence and across the diverse forms of evidence. So peer-reviewed literature, grey literature, and Indigenous and local knowledge. And we also included some Indigenous scientists as authors and experts in the assessment team. In the assessment, if you read through the full one, you'll see that there are lots of case studies. There are about 30 case studies from Africa digging into different issues. And one thing to highlight, and maybe we can have a discussion on this, is so that's kind of the formal writing team and who's mobilizing and synthesizing the evidence. But a really critical factor of these assessments is the review process. And what we found is there were really minimal comments from Africa in that review process. And this is one of the key ways to introduce new evidence, to highlight the work that you're doing, to ask some questions that we maybe haven't thought of. And so I just wanted to flag it there. And what the assessment does is this really dug into some of these interactions and provided some definitions on what is the nexus, what are these interlinkages, and what is a nexus type approach. So in all of the work that we were doing, we were really looking at these interactions. And so a lot of the evidence that we mobilized was it had to include at least 3 interactions between these nexus elements. So some of the sections of the SPM and in detail in all of the different chapters. So the first section provides an overview of the current interlinkages and interactions among the 5 nexus elements, exploring who is most affected from these interactions. And we really found that there's stark differences in terms of some of the inequalities that manifest as various direct and indirect drivers affect those interactions. Section B explored some feasible future nexus interactions, and that's Odi's on the call and can dig into some of those details. And we showed different ways to better understand the longer term challenges and opportunities for action within and across the 5 nexus elements. Section C and so from Section C onwards, it was moving into, so what can we do? We kind of present some of the existing challenges, and really in a similar line to the transformative change assessment, wanted to produce some feasible response options for various different actors to start implementing. And Section D focuses on some of those governance and financing options that can improve the way we manage these interlinkages, with a strong focus on ones and options that are both just and sustainable. And we also provide some practical guidance in the form of a roadmap for Nexus action. So in terms of looking at the past and current trends, what the assessment does is it really emphasizes through screening a lot of this evidence that biodiversity is essential for water, food, health, and climate, yet it's declining in all regions. This is not new news. Multiple assessments have also shown this, but really showing the value of looking at these things in a much more interconnected and integrated way. The assessment highlighted trends in indirect and direct drivers of biodiversity loss and how these impact other Nexus elements. We provide examples of interactions between the Nexus elements and these different drivers of change, and importantly, some of the cascading impacts. And so we've got an example and some figures that show these different connections and how impacts can cascade across systems, and also looks into some of the current societal, economic, and policy decisions that really do prioritize limited and short-term benefits while ignoring the negative impacts on Nexus elements. And that's essentially why we found ourselves in this kind of polycrisis that we're in around biodiversity loss, climate change, and pervasive inequality. And so that kind of sets the scene for the next section, saying, okay, given what we know now in terms of these interactions, what can we expect to see in the future? And so this next section looks at these future interactions with the understanding that if these current trends continue in terms of these indirect and direct drivers, what will the result be? And we can see that there are substantial negative outcomes across all Nexus elements, and an increase in some of the impacts of climate change. And what the analysis showed, looking at these different Nexus archetypes, and Odie can dig into those details, is that prioritizing a single Nexus element without regarding other elements results in trade-offs. But we also highlight there are positive outcomes for people and nature, and that those are feasible if we include integrated and timely adoption of multiple response options. So this looks at some of the scenario options that are available that positively impact biodiversity and other Nexus elements, also screening for how they can contribute to some of the policy goals. And this looks specifically at the Sustainable Development Goals. And we can speak about that more and what that means for some more regional impacts. So we really wanted to highlight the range of different response options that are available. And these were clustered, we categorized over 70. So these are in terms of ones that conserve ecosystems, ones that restore ecosystems, for managing ecosystems, ones around consuming sustainably, reducing pollution, more integrated planning and governance mechanisms, those for managing risk, ensuring rights and equity, and also those aligning finance, and then some others that didn't fit in these buckets. And when we were looking at these response options, these are ones that already exist. They're being implemented quite broadly. And also we looked at kind of cost effectiveness and those that align with that can be implemented to advance on kind of just and sustainable outcomes. So this is a table, we can't go into detail, but they were scored. So we scored a whole lot of different things that could have more positive impacts. So the bigger and the blue dots indicate those positive impacts. What we really wanted to highlight is that there are many response options that are already available to actors in lots of different sectors. So not just in the conservation and biodiversity sector for sustainably managing these Nexus elements. And they can be implemented across different scales and accounting for different contexts. And we provide a whole lot of different examples for these response options that have Nexus-wide benefits. So those that are related to sustainable use or managing invasive alien species, center around restoring inland water systems, working in sustainable inland fisheries, managing alien species. So a lot of the work that many of you, I'm sure, are already involved in. But what the assessment went on to do is to show how these could be bundled and sequenced in different ways to enhance their impacts. And so we also looked into how these different response options can contribute to various policy and global goals. So looking again at the Sustainable Development Goals, Global Biodiversity Framework Targets, and also the Paris Agreement. But because many of them focused on kind of ecosystem-based measures, there are lots of opportunities for these to also contribute to some other policy targets around, enhancing disaster risk reduction and strengthening resilience. And we provide examples within each of these chapters to show how various countries have maybe implemented some of these activities. The last section is really looking at what are the governance mechanisms. So similar to the transformative change, highlighting those different ways of governing systems that are integrative, inclusive, equitable, accountable, and providing a roadmap. So even though this seems linear, it's just a series of guidance steps that can be implemented in different contexts for understanding what the Nexus context may be, for thinking about what coordination needs to take place for strategic action, things around implementing and scaling, and not just thinking about kind of replicating things, but scaling up, out, and deep, and looking at those really important value and behavior changes that need to be implemented. And also thinking about those social and environmental safeguards that are really important. So echoing what was found in the transformative assessment about thinking about rights holders and kind of duty bearers, and what the kind of a whole of society approach could be for implementing these actions. The final chapter looked at options for transformation of economic and financial systems to facilitate greater investment across the Nexus, enhance kind of sustainability and equity for delivering these multiple outcomes. And then, just highlighted it in this roadmap that is a sequence. If you look into it, it's a sequence of questions that any decision maker operating in different scales can ask themselves and think about this. How do you convene actors to try and look for these different response options that can be implemented? So some of the relevance for the assessment is it really does, we hope to provide decision makers across the board, so a wide range of actors with the best available evidence on thinking about this in terms of more of a systems thinking and these interlinkages, and providing some really strong options and guidance on how they can evolve and what the options are for more integrated and holistic approaches. We identify the roles of different actors that different actors can, so all the way from kind of individuals to households to kind of some of the intergovernmental processes and the different roles that actors within those and institutions can play for addressing some of the crises and challenges. And then also some options for more integrated decision making that really leverage opportunities to bring some of the RIA conventions and targets and goals closer together, and some of the response options that can support various different role players for doing that. So yeah, I'll stop there, and thanks very much, and hopefully we can dig into some of the details, because what the assessment did, and especially for thinking about the context that we work in, is what are those examples where we can start implementing Nexus, more kind of Nexus-wide benefits in decision-making processes. And yeah, we can provide some of the examples that we came across in the assessment in the discussion. So thanks very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Nadia. That was a great whistle-stop tour also through the Nexus assessment in record time. And it's great to hear all the details being condensed down that far. So perhaps let me, get Karen to come online, and Odie as well, if you put your video on so that we can get into a question and answer session. What I might just say before handing over back to Luther perhaps is that, so my own pathway in this, as Nadia mentioned, I was a co-chair of the Nexus assessment for the first sort of year and a half or half of its process, and then became chair of the platform. And when we do these assessments, they're mandated by governments, they're requested by governments, and the topic is negotiated very heavily before the assessment team is even put together. And so the assessments have very fixed targets in terms of what they're supposed to address. And then coming out from an assessment to sort of looking at both of them operating together, the complementarity of the two assessments, I think, became really clear to me, for one. and then seeing, but the assessment teams, there's some interactions, but really they are independent teams that move forward, and they assure consistency, of course. But the real connectivity of the messaging across the two assessments, I think, is, to me, is one of the best results that we have. It was incredibly difficult to put out two large assessments at the same time, but it means that their consistency is very high, and they can be used together. Nexus to really look a lot more at the details of practical actions and how do you try and address multiple things all together. And then transformative change about, well, how do you go about that? What are the value systems? What are the, what are the visions? What are the things you have to think about behind the scenes to really make sure that you're doing it in the best way and with justice for all and so on. So I think they're incredibly useful to us. They both end with these practical guidance sort of approaches or roadmaps. And I think the assessment teams now are going to find that the demand for clarifications and for involvement and for more materials to help people use these assessments is going to balloon. It's really going to go through the roof. And there are many different networks that will assist us with that as well. So hopefully we'll have a lot of demand from Africa. And hopefully introducing these in the IUCN community will also help bring these IPBES assessments into our discussions in IUCN, not just on the continent, but also as we come up to the Congress and to thinking about the next strategic plan, which is very aligned with these assessments too, in terms of how it has come through. So I'll finish with that and look forward to engaging with you all in the questions coming up. So thanks. Back to Luther, I suppose.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Dr. Obura, Dr. Karen, and Dr. Nadia for those presentations. I would just want to open now for any questions. I don't yet see any. You can put up your hand. I think there was someone who had put up their hand earlier. Please feel free to put up your hand. I hope I'm able to see everyone here. Any questions? Okay, I don't know whether there's anything on the chat, but meanwhile, as we maybe as people are still coming through, I just wanted to ask to give two comments. One was about the overall opening slide, which was about inequality as a big driver, and I think that that touches not just as a social justice issue, but it's also a very big political issue, because then it is inequality between countries, it is inequality between peoples in a country, and it means that there need to be different levels through which this needs to be addressed. But I think it becomes a huge issue in terms of the negotiations for climate, for example, and I think it's the same when it comes to biodiversity laws negotiations. It's at the center. Now, I don't know at the level of course, probably from the point of assessment, maybe this doesn't come out, but what would be the key recommendations on the current negotiation processes to break down this inequality? Is it really effective? Is it producing results or not? Is there a need for different types of approaches around that? That's one. Then the second one is around the efficacy of conservation action. I know that this is quite exciting to hear that there is now evidence that actually conservation action does produce results. I think you mentioned in a time frame of about 10 years or so. This is still debatable, especially as we push for nature-based solutions. One of the things is saying, one of the criticisms of nature-based solutions is the fact that the rate of biodiversity loss and the rate of the impact of climate change surpasses the efforts made by nature-based solutions or any conservation action. I don't know what you'd have to say about that. I see Jeremy with his hand up. So Jeremy, you can go, and then the panel can ask their questions.
Yes, thank you so much. And just to say thank you for the presentations, really thought-provoking. I wanted to just touch on, I think, what was mentioned by Dr. O'Brien as it related to those leading and enabling a transformative change and how hard that can be, especially vis-a-vis, I can say maybe physical as well as structural violence. And maybe it's a provocative question, but I was wondering, what does the role IUCN or its members have in maybe, dare I say, helping, protecting these leaders of change? Because it's obviously it's a diplomatic political space. Maybe we can point to maybe some good case studies. Maybe it's in the legal avenue. Maybe there's other avenues. I was just interested in hearing on this, and yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, so yes, David and the team, you could take those first.
Okay, thank you, Luther. Perhaps what I'll do is just put a quick caveat and then give it to the team to pick up the questions they would like to, and I might add at the end. First, though, on your question on negotiations and inequalities in that space, of course, so IPBES is an intergovernmental body, and we provide science into policy spaces. So we don't sort of comment on specifically on negotiations. We provide non-prescriptive options for action. If you would like to achieve A, then B, C, D, E are your various options and their outcomes. What I would say in relation to the content of the assessment, so particularly from transformative change, is this issue of power relations. These underlying causes of power and dominance are, of course, play out in these negotiating spaces. And of course, with frameworks for justice, which we do have in the intergovernmental system, in the international system, of course, making those work is the key thing. And that's where we would identify how perhaps some of the findings from the assessments can be used to push that agenda to equalize power relationships in negotiating intergovernmental spaces. But let me leave it at that, and then perhaps I can hand to Karen and then Nadia and Odie for their responses.
Yeah, thank you. It's really an important question, and I think that's where we really emphasize that we're looking at transformative change for a just and sustainable world, not just a sustainable world. So justice is at the core of it. And Jeremy asked, like, what's the role of IUCN in actually promoting that justice and protecting the people who are working on the ground for these types of changes? And I think that you mentioned a few things. There are legal dimensions, there are communication dimensions, but I think it really is like the importance of supporting the people who are taking risks right now based on principles of transformative change, of equity and justice and pluralism and inclusion and respectful and reciprocal human nature relationships. How do we actually protect, support those people through our policies, through our practices, and I think to really acknowledge that, like that, the more voices you have giving rise to that. And that's where, like, the Nashalai Maasai Conservancy received an award from UNEP, I don't remember the Equator Award or Equator Award, yeah, and things. And, really, like, we need to pay more attention to what's working and those good things and showing people, because there's a lot of things that are we call them underlying causes because they're often like invisible from the mainstream discourse. And whenever you perturb a system, the status quo, you're going to get pushback. And we see that right now in the world. There is transformative change happening as we speak, and it's not in the direction. So our assessment really shows that it's not just about the size of the change, it's also the quality and the direction of the change. So if we can, like, really, like, amplify the people who are working on behalf of people and the planet and the equity for future generations and for other species as well, then I think we, like, it is about collaboration, it's co-production of knowledge, it is about putting ourselves together and, like, moving in the same direction. And I think IUCN has a really important role to play there in shaping that narrative. And that goes into strategy 5 of, like, how do we actually transform the societal narrative right now? So I'll pass to Nadia and she can bring the Nexus to perspective in.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, and thanks everyone for your questions. I'll kind of flit across a couple of them and then hand over to Odie. But I think maybe on the role of IUCN is, this is a process, and it's around trying to synthesize evidence in its diverse forms. But it's one process, and it's enriched by the evidence that exists, and it's, the more access we have to these documented case studies. And I think what's really wonderful about IPBES is that it does use diverse evidence. So it doesn't have to be peer reviewed kind of papers, and documenting and synthesizing these case studies. And IUCN, I think, through the work that you do on the ground and through the partners that you work with, can really do this. And importantly, not maybe case studies that are showing the problem, that's really important, but the options. Because when we worked with negotiators trying to move a lot of this evidence into action, and they're saying, but show us examples of where this works. Why should we invest in this? Sometimes, some of these investments are initially more expensive, but the benefits, the kind of co-benefits that are generated from them over time are really much more kind of useful. So it's, if you've got those kind of case studies, really synthesizing them, putting them out there for people to use. And then, as I mentioned, commenting through the review process. And that's another way to get a lot of the evidence that you're generating into those assessments, acting as experts, acting as reviewers, thinking about how to downscale some of this work into, the context that you work in is really important. And I think the work on, IUCN are kind of leaders in the space of setting out some of these kind of frameworks. And I'm connected to the Friends of Ecosystem-Based Adaptation that is convened by IUCN. And there we really are digging into, like, how can we make this more actionable? So looking at evidence across, from the IPCC, from IPBES, from multiple different spaces, from community groups that we're working with, to inform what those kind of standards, those norm standards and safeguard principles that are generated can look like, and really thinking about how those can be informed from bottom-up processes. So I think both of the assessments provide some guidance on how to do that. So if you are, initiating a process, how can we deepen some of the engagement, not just to look at some of the symptoms of the problem, but really the root causes of some of the issues and some of the questions you might want to ask. And I think there's some really great guidance there. Working across different sectors, and the Nexus assessment does that. And it's like, what are those new partnerships that maybe need to be brokered that are beyond the conservation sector, but actually, one response option can have multiple benefits across different systems, and especially health systems. And we provide some examples there around some of the health benefits from reducing disease burdens by removing invasive alien plants from systems. And then, documenting what that looks like in your landscapes and sharing that knowledge. We also work a lot around human rights. And so I think it's looking at, we often focus on targets of these policy frameworks, but not maybe some of the enabling mechanisms. So Section C of the new Global Biodiversity Framework really sets up the how, and it's complemented by these two assessments with how do you do it in ways that include diverse voices, multiple knowledge systems, respect human rights, respect the rights of various different rights holders in landscapes, and what are the roles and responsibilities of various different duty bearers. And it's hard because, sometimes these decisions, there will be, people that lose out, but how can you generate enough evidence so that that's clear? And I think the great thing about this, and we provide case studies from like youth initiatives, from, examples of working with people with disabilities, and how those can be included in projects. And I think the more we showcase that and the more evidence that's provided to support those community activities and advocacy work, we can start democratizing spaces, especially in a world that is shrinking. Those democratic spaces are really shrinking. So it's providing evidence to diverse communities, but they only sit in reports, and that's the first step. And it's how do we now, move it into different spaces as well. But I think it's also the kind of visioning process and the option space that we have. And maybe, just handing over to Odie, who works very much in the future space, to think about some responses there.
Yeah. Thanks, Nadia, David, and Karen. I think you've answered the other questions very well. So I'll maybe switch to the one on NBS. I think the question was how effective or how quickly can they deliver the benefits? And so one important thing I think that we're seeing from the scenario analysis is that the option in itself is not the issue as such, it's how you implement it. So it's always, if you put any option on the table, regardless of how well intentioned it is, the process of implementing it is what determines where it goes. So in the future scenarios, what we're seeing more and more is if you prioritize one thing, regardless of what it is, it could be a climate action that is obviously trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It could be done in a way that only achieves climate benefits at the expense of a number of other benefits, or it could be achieved in a way that it tries to achieve multiple benefits. So the effectiveness as such is determined by how widely it produces the benefits. And of course, in some cases that might slow down the process, so to speak, because you have to think about different things. But the cost is higher if you don't. So maybe the cost of doing it now seems higher, but over long term, the cost is much higher when you have to fix things that are basically negative outcomes of quick decisions that you take now without thinking about the broader benefits. Yeah, so that's essentially the view. I think that's really the main thing of the Nexus, is to consider other things that are related to the action you're taking at the moment. There was another question in the chat about, slightly different, but it's a quick one, about the comments in Africa that they're minimal, and what does it mean? What it means is that the Nexus assessment team is large, but is not large enough to cover everything. And so the review process is a critical and essential process of the assessment, in that the community comes together and look at the document that the author team produces and say, hey, you're missing this whole context about, let's say, West Africa. You're missing this whole context about Northern Africa. You're missing this context about another part of the world. So the less comments we get from the continent, the less likely we will get more contextual information about Africa. Obviously, we are doing our best to go to all the great literature, to go to all the sources of information to bring the evidence, but it is equally an important part for the community on the continent to really be involved and engaged, so that the outcomes that are coming from this assessment are reflective of the issues that you are well experienced in, work in, and understand very well. So that's really a critical process of this process. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for those responses. Sebatalo, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Chair. So as I was formulating my question, I wasn't, Nadia kept on responding to some of the questions that I had, but that's nice. I mean, Nadia, Karen, and Odile, you guys have had to deal with very, very complex assessments. I really want to commend you for putting this together, not only in collating the knowledge that is out there, but also trying to synthesize it to make sure that it is digestible and understandable to policymakers. So for me, as you're presenting it, because I wasn't involved in the Nexus itself or in the assessment itself, I just find it near impossible to really understand it. And I really wonder how the policymakers themselves are going to take it and make it into policy for health, policy for water, policy for biodiversity, and policy for business, or for many economy and all of that. So I was wondering, and maybe it's the question to David and IUCN here, in terms of how do you now synthesize this so that the policymakers at the level of least developed countries, for example, I come from the Kingdom of Lesotho, but I work in South Africa. But how do we make sure that whatever the assessment that you have undertaken is now able to filter into policy making, into evidence, into policy of an environment ministry in the small state of the Kingdom of Lesotho, for example? And that should make sense in terms of an assessment like this. I hope it's clear, my question. I mean, I find the assessment complex, and even more complex on policy. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sebatalo. I think that yeah, maybe just to the panel as well, to amplify that question, I think the issue is now that we have these reports, very practical steps on how do we apply this, and most of the people on this call are members who are, practitioners at the lowest level, some of them. So they'll be thinking about how do we put this into practice. So the practical side, but the other side is, and I think I saw some in the slide, some options which were some suggestions which had been made. But the second part of that question is about the communication, which I think Sebatalo was hinting to. Usually science information is so complex. Policymakers don't have the time to digest all of this. Are there policy, how do we communicate this in such a manner that it can actually drive action? Maybe that's the other part of it. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Sebatalo and Luther. So those are very direct questions, and then speak to why IPBES is there in the first place anyway. So a couple of layers that I'll try and say a number of things, and then perhaps others can pick up on some practical steps related to the assessments. So they are incredibly complex. So when we sit in our plenaries, we had, I think it was 30 hours of negotiation on the Nexus assessment on, so somebody counted that up. So that's sitting there discussing 40 pages of text with the figures and illustrations. And that's word by word in many cases. In many governments, especially in larger governments, not just developed countries, but emerging economies as well, and many of our countries too, there are experts in government who really know the content of conservation and sustainability, like any of the scientists or practitioners on this call or in various networks. And to some extent, these assessments sort of target those people because they're the ones that take that to their ministers and the people who make the decisions and can only have 10 minutes to talk about something before they have to appear on a stand and say something or approve things and so on. So we do make a really strong effort to go from the huge amount of scientific information in the chapters of the assessments, which are not yet out because it takes some time to complete those and tidy them up. The summary for policymakers is narrower, and that includes a lot of information still. And there are several levels in that, going to some short key messages, the bold sentences and the key messages, which are the shortest summary of the message. It's an trial and error. How do we get it right? We also have a communications department that is very strong and very good now at getting the message out on social media, to newspapers and reporters of many different types, to very top level technical sort of magazines that reach into specific contexts, but also to the general news media and so on. So we invest a lot in trying to get the message out. And then now also we're realizing, so for Africa in particular, there are two networks that are very strongly supportive of taking our messages into government circles. So one is supported by UNDP, the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Network, BESNet program. That's global, but they have quite a strong presence in Africa because they're based from Nairobi at the UN offices there. And then there's the IPBES program, it's called. It really focuses on Central and West Africa and Southern Africa, and with a focus on Francophone countries, fortunately, because of course there is a huge language barrier, which we're facing here because we're only talking in English in this webinar. So these two networks are ones that now we as the Secretariat, or the IPBES Secretariat, will partner with to try and get a lot of this complex information into digestible forms, into workshops, into fact sheets, into social media content and articles and so on. And we try and get authors from the assessments involved because they are the knowledge holders from the assessments as well, but they're volunteers, So all three over here are volunteering their time to continue to talk about an IPBES product that they volunteered 3 years of their life to produce in the first place. So it is a huge challenge, but we're very conscious of that. But the last thing I'll say is that what I find that is most powerful about these two assessments is that, past assessments like the global assessment, it was our big one, some of the IPCC ones, they are very high level, they're very global. But what we address in these two assessments is everyday life. So if you go and you talk to your uncle or your relative who's a farmer in a rural area, you can talk about all the issues of the Nexus assessment and all the issues of the transformative change assessment with them in ways that are directly relevant to their lives. And they will tell you what they are facing. And we could translate those into the academic sort of science language that we use to synthesize this information. So I think that's where the power of these two assessments will be as we communicate it out and people understand what they relate to. And so I think for IUCN members, they relate very closely to all the challenges that we face on the ground in doing conservation. That's why I have sort of come from our conservation community into IPBES, because I see it as the place where, you know, the real integration of knowledge that we need for success is happening right now. And we need to get it out into our governments, into decision makers, to businesses, and so on. And we, IUCN members, can be the champions for that, because it relates so well to what our objectives are and the partners that we work with at all different levels. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that, and perhaps if the others want to add anything to this.
Add a little on the, you know, because transformative change feels very complicated, but we need to actually communicate it in a way that is simple but not simplistic. So we spent a lot of time talking about, like, what are the take-home messages, and really there's four. You know, transformative change addresses the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature's decline. It involves principled strategies and actions. It results from both small-scale and large-scale changes, and it identifies roles for everyone in enabling these transformative changes. And it kind of brings me to the comment Leo had about, you know, how do we drive transformative change and impact at scale? Right now, we are very fragmented. We are not taking a Nexus approach, and we're, you know, the underlying causes are patterns. They're social and cultural patterns that are very context specific in every place. So how do we go from creating these like fragments into creating like fractal patterns, self-similar patterns that are based on these principles that actually resonate and spread? So in the case of the National Maasai community, it's having an impact outside of Africa. Other people are coming from all over the world to say, how are you doing this? So as we create these patterns that are very, you know, based on these the principles and the approaches and things like, then we can actually scale it much faster than we think. And that's where we have to show the evidence now, and that's why IUCN is really important.
Maybe I can just jump in on the complexity, and I think science and even universities have done a very good job about making it seem more complex and putting in different disciplines and kind of creating sectors and removing the connections. But what we found is, especially when we were looking into kind of indigenous knowledge, is that they have a Nexus approach. They understand the connections. It features in, and many people, if you speak to kind of local farmers, they see the world as interconnected. They're part of nature. They intimately know the relationship between food, water, weather patterns. And so I think it's inherently people know that these things are interconnected, and yet we're making decisions that kind of are a lot more siloed. And the support that we get for doing that, you know, we've got climate finance, or we've got biodiversity finance, or we've got development finance. And actually a lot of that is, if we think about these more integrated solutions, and so linking to what David said, I think what we tried to do in the assessment is to simplify some of the noise that's out there, because there's so many different, you know, response options, but really to look at the ones that can address it in a more integrated way and say, like, well, here are some examples. What does it look like in your context? And here's some questions if you want to think about implementing something similar. You know, is it appropriate? What type of actors need to be involved? Where does power sit? How do you resource it? What type of other knowledge do you need? And so I think it's in some ways we try to reduce the complexity to a level that appeals to various different decision-making contexts. And then I think it's also linked to one of the slides David showed, making the case in different communities. So some, you know, the economic communities really showing some of the economic impact. So, you know, nature contributes to about over 50% of global GDP, and yet we reinvest less than 1%. So showing some of those things and the statistics and what delayed action means, and how it reduces those different opportunity contexts, I think is also something that we wanted to do. So how do you communicate into the knowledge communities? Where do we need some more research practitioners? What is the guidance that we can give, but also how can we draw on practitioner experience? Policy spaces, how can we look across different conventions and looking at the synergies between them? And I think it's it's trying to bring that together. So those suggestions of, you know, more regional understandings of these things, and it would be wonderful to like go back now. And I was also involved with some of the other people on this call in the IPBES Africa assessment, and thinking like, what would it look like now if we took kind of a Nexus and transformative approach to that type of assessment? And so we can wait for IPBES to do that, or we can also think about mobilizing internal kind of resources, having workshops, inviting other stakeholders into our spaces to start collaborating more. So if there isn't another regional assessment, we're ready with some of the evidence, but we can also start informing decisions across different scales based on what we know already. And I think we've got so much collective intelligence, but it just sits in lots of different pockets. You know, some people working on conservation, other people working on food systems, and really thinking about how to bring some of those conversations closer together. But it's hard and it's resource intensive just in terms of kind of like human capacity, but I think it is focusing on those bright spots and those really innovative and exciting case studies, social movements that exist, and both assessments really do highlight them. So that's quite an exciting space in a world that seems to be quite doom and gloom at the moment.
Thanks so much for that. I don't know whether there's another question somewhere. Okay, yeah. Probably not, I don't seem to see anyone with their hand up. Just one other thing about where we are at currently as IUCN members. I think one of the big discussions that's been consistently coming whenever we have convened, whether it is the Africa Protected APAC, that was Africa Protected Area Congress, or it was recently we had something called the Africa Conservation Forum. What is coming up very consistently is the fact that there is a need for new models for conservation. And the question is the how. How do we make this come into practice? And I think that the new models for conservation, first of all, that whole desire arises out of a few things. One is the current costs for keeping conservation as is unbearable. There are just no resources to keep it running that way. The second one, of course, is the fact that it's just an inherited model. And so some parts don't actually resonate with the current forms of government. So it has issues around human rights to maintain it the way it is. Of course, there are huge equity issues around land use. But the good part, which is also coming out, is the fact that conservation areas, there are many conservation areas outside of the current protected areas. And so the model should be the type which are inclusive and able to build that up. Just looking at the evidence that's coming out from this report, do you think that, or rather, what kind of principles do you think we could pick up to help build this whole idea of building new conservation models in Africa? And then maybe the second part would be as we are moving towards the World Conservation Congress, Africa really would want to have a very big presence, but also would want to have more or less something that is impactful in terms of what we take forward into the coming years. Is there what specific information do you think we could take from this report to the WCC as Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks, Luther. So those are very big questions. So I'll try and remember both sides of them, and I might speak now as much as an IUCN member as coming from IPBES, knowing what IPBES can bring us in terms of this space. So what I think in terms of the general models is we have this really strong tension in IPBES. We have our framing, our conceptual framework is fully we try and design it so it's fully inclusive of all knowledge systems, which means there's the Western sort of dominant system that we're in right now, and Western sciences and so on, and how they're defined. There's also Eastern and other ones, and there's indigenous community and so on. So how do we make sure that we're thinking holistically enough? And many systems don't separate people and nature, but our Western system perhaps separates people and nature to the greatest extent of any, to the extent of this economic domination that we see. And one of the big challenges we're facing in the conservation community has been, rather than focusing just on nature, how do you include people and nature together always? And so I think that's the inclusive framing that you're asking about. If we're looking at the social and the environmental context across Africa, we really need to have a people focus because of the realities of today, while we work out how to sustain and improve natural systems as well. So we're trying to work out how to do that and be able to communicate it effectively enough that it can move things forward. I think one of the signals of that I've felt in the conservation community has been this focus, say the findings that Karen presented of these 5 strategies really align well with things that were emerging from critiques that I was involved in, others of the global biodiversity framework. It's not enough to work just on nature. You have to economic actions and societal actions as well, which relates to Nexus. But then those 5 strategies really sort of arrange across that sort of domain as well, with so much more nuance about how you approach, what are the principles you should bring to bear, what are the specific strategies that are possible and actions and so on. So moving towards IUCN's, the strategy in the future, it shouldn't just be about nature or nature positive. Nature and people positive have to be completely integrated together in the initial communication, in the phraseology and the wordings that we use, because then, as Leo has put in the chat, we could bring all of our networks and resources together, to work together and amplify progress. But unless the framing is fully people and nature together from the beginning, we'll always end up sidelining one or the other. And I think that's I think really important for Africa moving forward, and then perhaps Africa's voice in the Congress and the next strategy. So I think the strategy already goes a long way in terms of, it talks about global transformations and different systems that need to change and so on. But, now that we have the assessments out, they could really contribute to perhaps to the review and final discussions on that strategy as we move up to the Congress. And I would love to see that happen and help contribute in that process as a member or as IPBES as maybe productive. Yeah, so that's how I see those 2 things coming together, I guess. And perhaps if the others would like to comment, they may not. I'm not sure if they're involved in IUCN as members or experts, because it's outside of your areas. But Odi, you've opened your mic.
Yeah, not to speak about IUCN, I'm afraid, but I think there was a question about models for conservation, and I think, David, you really hit the nail on the head with the people and nature on the outset framing. What we're already seeing around the world, and which is something that might be coming to Africa, it's not as strongly yet, but we're seeing protected areas being downsized, they're being downgraded, degazetted, and the main reason for that is because the framing is such that a protected area is something that's out there, outside of, it operates as its own entity, and other people are looking at it as a source of materials, of minerals, and things like that. So because of that initial conception of this thing as something that sits outside of society, so to speak, it faces threats, or most of them are facing threats now of being downscaled because people feel excluded or not part of this sort of this entities. Of course, they've done a lot of work in protecting biodiversity itself. That's completely undeniable. But what we're also seeing is, protected areas being protected by big guns and things like that. That's not a good sign. If at the end of the day, it should be something that people recognize as important to both biodiversity and to themselves. And so I think the model should take into account this idea that it should have this sort of double benefits for people and nature, and not one or the other, or not one over the other rather. So I think that would be really critical for a continent like Africa. It's even more critical because of the development needs, the huge development needs. So you don't want to have protected areas being targeted as places you have to turn around to develop. And I think that's a huge risk that we run if we don't consider sort of the people-nature benefits. Thanks.
I can just follow up on that, because I think that, like what you said too, is really important in terms of, like, I mean, transformative change happens when we question our assumptions and what has been driving the status quo. And we say, like, oh, okay, there's a different way of doing this. There's, does this actually make sense in the current context? And I think, reflecting on the transformative change assessment, it's a very intellectual project, but it also is very much like, how do you connect with people's hearts? And I think that was, our group was very much into that. Like, how do you, what do they care about deeply, not just for themselves, but for everyone? And then when you can touch that space and generate a conversation, and it goes back to, I think, what Nadia was saying, like, we don't want this to be just a sit on the shelf assessment. We want it to generate these conversations and really, connect with people at what matters to them. And I think that's where the old model of conservation has failed, because it separates rather than connects people. So I think we have a lot of transformative potential to be realized. And as we said in the assessment, the results, the positive impacts, can occur very quickly once we overcome those barriers.
Yeah, and maybe, exactly with this framing, and I think a lot of the kind of solutions that are being offered, whether it's a carbon market, a biodiversity offset, a nature-based solution, even if it isn't kind of approached with that framing and looking at the multiple benefits of nature as well, that aren't just around the more kind of instrumental values, I think can set us on a good stead for interrogating, like, who really benefits from some of these. Some people call them false solutions, in terms of like a market mechanism to address a problem that it created in the first place. Like, there are other ways to start thinking about how we reconfigure systems, because we've still got phenomenal kind of natural assets, innovation, a really young population that is going to be more urban, and thinking about how we kind of harness that in amazing creativity and energy, and also natural resources, in ways that support kind of local well-being, and maybe not, restructuring some of the power hierarchies, because I think who sets to benefit is often mostly big multinational corporations, and with very limited benefits. So even a lot of the funding schemes that exist, very little reaches the hands of people that are living adjacent to kind of wild areas, living adjacent to wildlife populations. And so also trying to think about how can we do more locally led approaches to conservation, especially around communities that know what their needs are, and can also be, part of the system and community co-management, systems that can do that. And there are movements for thinking about, like, basic conservation income, instead of, as a grant for people that are living in these diverse places, but thinking about how can we start learning from initiatives that are working. But I think it is really scary being involved in some of these global fora, where there are these very slick solutions that are being presented as a solution without understanding the complexity. And I think that's something that we can be better at. And these assessments provide some examples and some questions that we can start asking. If a community is presented with an option, they can start asking some of these connections of how the response may influence other impacts. So what will be the health impacts? How does this, contribute to carbon emissions or supporting communities to adapt? And so it just provides a bit of guidance around that.
Yeah, thanks so much. I know that our time is now fast spent. We only have 2 more minutes remaining. Unless there's something, any parting shot, David, that you'd want to mention.
I suppose what I'll say quickly, because it's 1 minute and 5 seconds, I think, on the timer, and perhaps responding to Tim Snow's last question, is human greed not too great to remove protections? I think what these assessments show is that, yes, there are some worldviews that promote greed incredibly, but there are many that don't. And so amplifying those and contesting the ones that do promote greed is very important. And it's not necessarily the greed, it's not the greed locally, but it's greed often far removed in the global system that is driving these changes. And so how do we address that? And I think we had a last meeting of the Transformative Change Assessment team just yesterday, produced this report just at the moment that, a leading country in the US, there are executive orders that are pushing precisely in the opposite direction to what our assessments are showing is necessary for sustainability. So there must be ways to contest that, and we are part of the community that needs to find those. So onward.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that. And just to thank you, David, Karen, Nadia, and Odirirwe for this very nice engagement, and also for being the very first session for the Fireplace. I think this has been very engaging, and you have been able to break down for us a very complex process to what is digestible. I think the commitment we take from here is to continue to engage with you in the different sessions of the Fireplace that interface with the evidence that is required for the different parts of the sessions that we are going to have. But also, I think that we certainly take responsibility to see how best to utilize this body of information for action. And I see two major areas. One is in the area of policy influencing. And today, the big ask for IUCN by governments is to support a sector-wide kind of guidance into implementation of various things. And I think that basing it on these reports would be a very good frame for that. And there are some countries which are already wanting to pioneer this way of thinking and this way of work. So I see a very big entry that we can work on together on that. And of course, most of our members are driving locally led actions at community level. And again, this is a useful place to incorporate, especially the principles, the various patterns, and the building up case studies of success. I think that's going to be a great place. And of course, in terms of communication, I think we'll just need to have, at least from this region, we'll make sure that we bring in our communication of the key messages backed up by the evidence, which is also linked with these particular reports. To improve, societal understanding, but also to continue driving action. And for everyone who was able to join in, thank you so much. And again, you look out for more information for the next sessions. So greatly appreciate it. And so David will follow up on some of the action items to see what we take forward. Thank you, everyone, and wish you a good afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Luther, and thank you all.